Good morning everyone. So today the reflection is about Luke 12 verses 13 to 21. And just before we dive into the particular passage, I think it's useful just to orientate ourselves in the book of Luke. So there's sort of three sections of the book of Luke, and in the first one Jesus is telling us about, or Luke is telling us about who Jesus is, and that he's like a fulfillment of the Old Testament and God's promises. And we find out about Jesus' manifesto for the kingdom of God, that is this upside down kingdom that is going to free the poor and the lower social status and the oppressed. And at the end of the first part, he sort of tells us that he's going to go to Jerusalem and die to sort of bring this kingdom about. And then in the middle section, he's on his journey to Jerusalem, and in the final section, he's in Jerusalem and he's died and is resurrected. And this story sits in the middle part. So while we're on the journey to Jerusalem with Jesus, and on this journey, Jesus is teaching his disciples, and anyone who's around, but a lot of the people who are around are his disciples, about what it means to follow him and to follow God. And this particular story is one of a few parables that Jesus tells about wealth and possessions and what they mean for our relationship with God. It's essentially about so someone comes to Jesus and says, I want you to make a decision for me of how to divide the inheritance with my brother. And Jesus says, don't let your life become about possessions. And he tells this parable about a rich man who produces a lot of crops and realizes his storehouses are too small, so he spends his life building a bigger storehouse, and he gets to the point where he's got this huge storehouse full of stuff, and he's like, yeah, this is great. And then God's like, no, your life's going to be required of you today, and who's going to use the things that you've built up? Like, you shouldn't be laying up treasure with yourself without being rich towards me. So that's what the story is. And it's one of a few stories in this section, like I say, which are about kind of wealth and possessions. And I think when you read these stories, if you read them on a surface level, it can be really easy to think that Jesus is anti-money or God is anti-money. But that doesn't quite check out, because we know that Jesus sits down to have meals with rich tax collectors, and he stays in the house of rich businesswomen, and so he's clearly not anti people who have resources. Resources are necessary for his ministry, and he relies on the generosity of those around him. I think that a way of reading these stories that's useful is to kind of step back and think about how we define money and possessions. And I think hopefully a lot of you would agree with me that all of the money and possessions that we have are actually gifts. They're gifts from God. And I think when you reframe what we look at as money and possessions as gifts, it changes the way you see these stories. Because a gift, the way you relate to a gift is not just about the object itself, it's about your relationship with the giver. So if you ignore the giver, then you miss out on a lot of the value of the gift and the object. So for example, Micah, my husband, he gives me many gifts, but if when I received those gifts and used those gifts, I didn't acknowledge Micah or acknowledge the love that is put into giving me those gifts, then I would have a pretty empty marriage. And I think that our relationship with God is the same. He gives us so many gifts, but if we orient our lives around the objects and the possession, instead of orient it around the gifts instead of the giver, then our life, the purpose of our life, isn't quite oriented correctly, and we miss out on a lot of the richness that God has to share with us, and the richness of that relationship. And I think it's really interesting because, and this is true of a lot of things in the Bible, I suppose, but I think that the problems that I see in myself and in the people around me in terms of my relationship to stuff is very similar today to what I see portrayed in the parables that Jesus tells us about wealth. And that's 2,000 years ago, right? So we still have things to learn from these parables today. So yeah, just to kind of apply that specifically to the parable is, you know, this rich man, the whole purpose of his life is oriented around building up the possession and keeping it safe. And he therefore, you know, his life is forfeit, and we know he's not rich towards God, and so he misses out on that relationship with God. So I hope that today, as you go through your journey with Jesus, that you would be able to sort of orient yourself around the giver and not the gifts.